When I sold my house, everyone called me brave. They told me I was finally doing something with my life, chasing a dream most people only watch from a distance. I believed every word. I believed I was making the smartest decision of my entire life. 5 months later, I was back where I started. Except I no longer had a house to come home to. No savings left in my name. No idea how I was supposed to rebuild a life I had completely given away for a promise that was never real to begin with. What happened to me in those 5 months still feels difficult to put into words. The moment I realized I had been deceived. The nights I cried without anyone hearing me. The decision that finally broke me enough to come home. But there's one part of this story I think about more than anything else. The real reason everything fell apart was never the place I went to. It was something I refused to admit to myself before I ever got on that plane. If you've ever felt like running away to somewhere new could fix everything wrong in your life, please watch until the end. My story might save you from making the same mistake I did. I still remember the exact moment I decided to sell my house. It wasn't a dramatic decision made in a single breath. It built up slowly, like water rising under a door, until one morning I woke up and realized I had already made up my mind. My name is Sneha Joshi. I am 34 years old, and before any of this happened, I lived a quiet, ordinary life in a medium-sized town in India. Nothing about my life was extraordinary. I had a small house that my father left me, a modest job at a local accounting firm, and a routine so predictable that I could tell you what day it was just by what I was doing at that hour. But predictable does not mean peaceful. Every evening after dinner, I would sit on my bed with my phone in my hand and scroll through videos of Dubai, glittering towers reflecting the sunset, wide, clean highways with luxury cars gliding past. Women my age, dressed beautifully, walking through malls that looked like palaces, influencers showing off apartments with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sea. I watched these videos the way some people watch movies, as an escape from a life that felt too small, too slow, too far from the world I imagined I deserved. I want to be honest about something most people don't admit when they tell these stories. I wasn't desperate when I started watching those videos. I had a steady income. I had family nearby. I had food on my table every night, but I had also reached an age where I began comparing my life to the lives of others, and that comparison ate at me quietly, day after day, until it became something close to obsession. I started searching for jobs in Dubai, not casually, seriously. I joined groups, followed pages, asked questions in forums where other Indian women shared their success stories of moving abroad. Most of those stories were filtered, polished, incomplete. I didn't know that yet. All I saw were smiling faces in front of skyscrapers and captions that said things like, 6 months in Dubai changed my life forever. Then, one evening, a message arrived that felt like fate. A recruitment agent reached out to me through a job platform. He said his name was Rashid, and he represented a placement agency that specialized in finding work for Indian professionals in the UAE. He was polite, fast to respond, and incredibly convincing. He told me about a position as an office administrator for a logistics company in Dubai. The salary he quoted was nearly 3 times what I was earning in India. He sent me photos of the office, sleek, modern, full of glass and light. He told me the company provided housing, transportation, and even health insurance. I remember sitting on my bed that night, staring at the ceiling, doing the math over and over in my head. 3 times my salary. In a few years, I could save enough to buy a much bigger house. I could finally help my younger brother with his education. I could send money to my mother every month without worrying about my own expenses. For the first time in years, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Real hope. The kind that makes your chest feel lighter. But there was a problem. The agency required payment up front for visa processing, document verification, agency fees, and the flight ticket. The total came to an amount that I simply did not have in savings. When I asked Rashid if there was another way, he said most candidates either took a loan or sold an asset, since the investment would pay for itself within the first 2 months of work. He said it so casually, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. I spent days going back and forth in my mind. I called my closest friend, Mira, and explained everything to her. She was skeptical. She asked me, Sneha, do you even know this company? Have you spoken to anyone who actually works there? I didn't have good answers. I told her I had seen photos, that the agent seemed professional, that this was my chance to finally change my life. She didn't argue further, but I could hear the worry in her voice. I also called my mother, though I didn't tell her everything. I only told her I had a job opportunity in Dubai and that the salary was excellent. She was proud, almost emotional. She told me my father would have been proud too. That single sentence settled something in me. I decided I was going to do it. The hardest part wasn't filling out forms or talking to the agent. The hardest part was deciding to sell the house. That house wasn't just 4 walls and a roof. It was where my father used to sit every morning with his tea, reading the newspaper on the small balcony. It was where I had grown up, where I had cried after his death, where I had built whatever stability I had in my adult life. But I told myself that a house was just a structure, bricks and cement, and that the real wealth I needed to build was my future. I told myself that holding on to an old house out of sentimentality was foolish when there was an opportunity in front of me that could change everything. I listed the house with a local real estate agent, and within 3 weeks I had a buyer. The amount I received was modest by international standards, but for me, it represented years of my father's hard work and my own. I remember the day I signed the final papers. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from a strange mixture of grief and excitement. I was closing one chapter of my life to open another, and I genuinely believed the next chapter would be better. From that money, I paid the agency fees, an amount equivalent to nearly half of what I had received from selling the house. I paid for visa processing, document verification, medical tests, and the flight ticket. The agent assured me that once I started working, all of this would feel like a small investment compared to what I would be earning every month. I packed 2 suitcases with my entire life, clothes, a few photographs of my parents, some jewelry my mother had given me, and copies of all my documents. I left the rest of my belongings with my aunt, telling her I would send for them once I had settled into my new apartment in Dubai. The apartment the agency had described to me in such vivid detail that I could practically picture myself standing on its balcony, looking out at the city lights. The night before my flight, I couldn't sleep. I sat on the floor of my empty house, my house, though it technically belonged to someone else now, and looked around at the bare walls where furniture used to be. I felt an overwhelming sense of both loss and anticipation. I remember whispering to myself, almost like a prayer, "This is going to be worth it. This is the beginning of everything." My friends and neighbors who came to see me off before I left for the airport called me brave. They said I had courage that most people lack, the courage to leave everything behind and chase something better. I smiled and thanked them, feeling a swell of pride in my chest. I believed every word they said. I believed I was making the smartest decision of my life. As I sat in the airport, waiting to board my flight, I looked at the boarding pass in my hand and felt my heart pounding with excitement. I had no idea, sitting there in that plastic airport chair with my passport clutched tightly in my fingers, that within a few months I would be sitting in a different airport, waiting for a different flight, one heading home, carrying far less than I had brought with me, and far more pain than I ever imagined possible. But that night, all I could feel was hope, pure, blinding hope. I boarded the plane to Dubai believing I was flying toward the best version of my life. I had absolutely no idea what was actually waiting for me on the other side. The moment I stepped out of Dubai International Airport, I felt the heat wrap around me like a thick blanket, dry, heavy, and unfamiliar. It was nothing like the humid heat back home. For a few seconds, I just stood there, dragging my suitcases, looking up at the enormous structures around me, feeling like I had truly arrived somewhere extraordinary. I remember thinking, I did it. I am finally here. A driver from the agency picked me up, holding a small piece of paper with my name written on it. He didn't speak much English, and I didn't speak Arabic, so our conversation was limited to nods and gestures. As we drove, I pressed my face close to the window, watching the skyline pass by, the same buildings I had seen hundreds of times in videos, except now they were real, towering above me in person. For those first 30 minutes, everything felt like a dream coming true. But the further we drove from the city center, the more the scenery changed. The glass towers gave way to older, more crowded neighborhoods. The wide, polished highways turned into narrower streets lined with labor accommodations. I told myself it was probably just the route we were taking, that my actual accommodation was somewhere nicer, closer to the office I had been promised. We finally stopped in front of a building that looked nothing like the apartment photos the agency had shown me. It was an old structure, the paint peeling slightly at the corners, with laundry lines stretched across several balconies. My stomach tightened, but I told myself not to panic. Maybe this was just temporary housing before I moved into my real apartment. I was led up to the 3rd floor and into a small room. Inside, there were already 4 other women, 2 from Kerala, 1 from Nepal, and 1 from the Philippines. There were 4 narrow beds pushed against the walls, leaving barely any space to walk. A small shared bathroom was attached, and the kitchen was a tiny counter with a single burner shared by everyone on the floor. I stood in the doorway with my suitcases, completely speechless. One of the women, Angeli, looked at me with a tired but kind expression and said, "New here?" I nodded, still unable to find words. She gave a small, knowing smile, the kind of smile that comes from someone who has already lived through the same shock I was experiencing. "It's not what they showed you, is it?" she asked. I shook my head, feeling my throat tighten. That first night, lying on a thin mattress in a room with 4 strangers, I cried as quietly as I could. I didn't want anyone to hear me. I kept replaying everything in my mind: the photos of the apartment, the promises of the agent, the salary figures we had discussed. None of it matched what was in front of me. But I told myself, maybe the job itself will be different. Maybe the apartment was just an error, and the real opportunity is still ahead. The next morning, I was taken to the company office, and at least this part matched the photos. It really was modern, with glass walls and a polished reception area. For a moment, my hope flickered back to life. I was introduced to my supervisor, a stern woman who explained my responsibilities quickly, without much warmth. I was told I would be working as an administrative assistant, handling paperwork, data entry, and coordination between departments. It didn't take long to understand the truth of my situation. My actual contract, the one I signed once I arrived, not the one I had reviewed before leaving India, listed a salary nearly half of what Rashid had originally promised. When I asked about the discrepancy, my supervisor told me, almost dismissively, "This is the standard salary for this position. If the agency promised you more, that is between you and them." My stomach dropped. I felt the floor shift beneath me, though nothing physically had changed. I tried calling Rashid that evening, but his number was no longer reachable. I tried messaging him through the platform where we had originally connected, but my messages went unanswered. The realization hit me slowly, painfully. I had been misled, and there was no one to hold accountable. Within the first week, my passport was collected by my employer for visa processing and record-keeping, as they explained. I didn't think much of it then, since this seemed to be common practice among the other women in my building. But as the weeks went on, every time I asked about getting my documents back, I was met with vague answers and requests to wait a little longer. Slowly, an uneasy feeling settled into my chest, the realization that without my passport, my freedom to leave whenever I wanted no longer felt entirely in my own hands. My work hours were nothing like what had been described to me. I was expected to be at the office by 7 in the morning, and often didn't leave until 9 or 10 at night. Some days stretched even longer when there were urgent deadlines. I was working between 12 and 14 hours a day, with only short breaks for meals. The exhaustion settled into my bones in a way I had never experienced before. Back home, I worked steady hours and came home to rest, to cook, to call my mother. Here, I barely had energy to shower before collapsing onto my narrow bed each night. The cost of living was another shock. I had assumed that with a good salary, expenses would feel manageable. But everything in Dubai was expensive: transportation, food, even basic necessities. The company provided minimal support beyond the shared accommodation, and I quickly realized that the monthly amount I was earning barely covered my living costs, let alone allowed me to save anything to send home. I remember the first time I tried to send money to my mother. I had promised her before I left that I would support her and my younger brother once I started earning in Dubai. When I sat down to calculate what I could send, after deducting rent contribution, transportation, food, and small necessities, there was almost nothing left. I sent a small amount that month, embarrassed at how little it was compared to what I had promised her over the phone before leaving. The women I shared the room with became my only source of comfort during those early weeks. Angeli especially took me under her wing. She had been in Dubai for nearly 2 years and had her own story of being misled by an agency. "Everyone has a version of this story," she told me one night as we sat on the floor of our small room, sharing a simple dinner of rice and dal. "Different country, same trick. They show you the dream, and then you arrive and find the truth." Her words stayed with me long after that conversation ended. I began noticing small things that chipped away at my spirit daily. The way my supervisor spoke to me, often impatient and dismissive. The way my coworkers, who had been in Dubai longer, seemed resigned rather than hopeful, as if they had accepted that this was simply how things were, and complaining changed nothing. The way I would walk past the glittering malls and skyscrapers I once admired in videos, now feeling like an outsider looking into a world I could never actually be part of, despite living right in its shadow. At night, after work, I would sometimes walk to a nearby park just to breathe air that wasn't recycled through office air conditioning. I would sit on a bench and call my mother, putting on a cheerful voice, telling her everything was wonderful, that Dubai was beautiful, that my job was going well. I couldn't bring myself to tell her the truth. I didn't want her to worry. And more than that, I didn't want to admit to myself, out loud, that I had made a terrible mistake. But late at night, after those calls ended and I lay on my thin mattress listening to the soft breathing of 4 other women around me, I would stare at the ceiling and feel a heaviness in my chest that I had never experienced before. I had sold my father's house, the only inheritance I had, for a life that looked nothing like what I had been promised. I had left behind everything familiar for a salary that couldn't even support my basic needs, in a job that demanded more hours than I had ever worked in my life, in a city that I now realized had never actually been waiting for me with open arms. I kept telling myself it would get better. I kept telling myself that this was just the adjustment period, that things would improve once I settled in, once I understood the system better, once I built some savings. I held on to that hope desperately, because the alternative, admitting that I had made an irreversible mistake, felt too unbearable to face. I had no idea in those early weeks just how much worse things were about to become before they would ever get better. By the 3rd month, my savings, the little I had managed to keep aside after selling my house and paying the agency, had completely disappeared. What remained of that money had gone into covering gaps in my monthly expenses, gaps that the company's so-called competitive salary never seemed to close. I had arrived in Dubai believing I would be the one sending money home. Instead, I found myself quietly hoping nothing unexpected would happen, because I no longer had a financial cushion to fall back on. It was around this time that I discovered something that made my stomach turn. While reviewing my payslip details with one of the other women in my room, I realized that a portion of my salary was automatically being deducted every month, listed under the vague label of accommodation and processing fee. When I asked the accounts department about it, I was told this was a standard deduction to cover the costs the company had incurred in sponsoring my visa and arranging housing. No one had explained this to me clearly before I signed my actual contract. I had been so overwhelmed and exhausted upon arrival that I had simply trusted the paperwork placed in front of me, signing where I was told to sign, without fully understanding what I was agreeing to. This deduction, combined with the already lower-than-promised salary, meant that my monthly take-home amount was barely enough to survive, let alone save or send home. I remember sitting with a calculator on my phone late one night, adding and subtracting numbers over and over, hoping I had made an error somewhere, hoping the math would somehow work out differently. It never did. The emotional toll of this realization was almost harder to bear than the financial one. I had built an entire narrative in my mind, to my mother, to my friends back home, even to myself, that I was thriving in Dubai. Admitting that the numbers simply did not add up meant admitting that the story I had been telling everyone was false. I felt a deep, suffocating shame that I had never experienced before in my life. Around this time, I also began experiencing physical symptoms of stress that I had never dealt with before. I had trouble sleeping, even when exhausted from work. My appetite disappeared for days at a time. I would sit at my desk during work hours and suddenly feel a wave of anxiety wash over me so intensely that I had to excuse myself to the restroom just to breathe and steady myself. I didn't have a name for what I was feeling then. I only knew that something inside me felt like it was slowly breaking. Anjali noticed the change in me before I admitted it to myself. One evening, she sat beside me on the floor of our room and asked gently, "Sneha, when did you last eat a proper meal?" I couldn't answer her right away. She didn't push further, but she started quietly making sure I ate something each evening, even if it was just a small portion of whatever she had cooked. Her kindness, in the middle of everything falling apart, was one of the few things that kept me from completely collapsing emotionally during those weeks. I called my mother less frequently during this period, because I found it harder and harder to maintain the cheerful voice I had been using since I arrived. When she asked why I sounded tired, I blamed it on work, on the heat, on anything except the truth. But mothers often sense more than we give them credit for. One night, she asked me directly, "Sneha, are you happy there?" I broke down crying on the phone, unable to hold back any longer. I told her everything: the salary, the room, the hours, the deductions, the passport being held by my employer. There was a long silence on the other end of the line before she finally said softly, "Come home. We will figure it out together." Her words gave me permission to admit what I had been avoiding for weeks, that staying in Dubai under these conditions was not building the future I had imagined. It was slowly destroying my present, but leaving wasn't simple. My passport was still with my employer, and I had to formally request its return, citing personal reasons for resignation. The process took nearly 3 weeks, filled with delays, additional paperwork, and an uncomfortable meeting with my supervisor, who seemed almost offended that I wanted to leave. She reminded me of the investment the company had made in bringing me to Dubai, as if my struggling to survive on the salary they provided was somehow my failure to appreciate their generosity. During those 3 weeks of waiting, I had to continue working, continue showing up every day to an office where I now felt like a stranger, continue living in that small room with 4 other women, knowing that I was counting down the days until I could finally leave. It was a strange, suspended kind of existence, physically present in Dubai, but emotionally already gone. I also had to figure out how to afford my return flight. The small amount of money I had managed to save after the deductions was barely enough to cover a basic one-way ticket home. I had no funds left for anything beyond that. No cushion for emergencies, no savings to start rebuilding my life once I landed back in India. I remember feeling a strange kind of numbness as I purchased that ticket, watching months of hope and sacrifice condense down into a single, modest flight booking. In my final days in Dubai, I found myself looking at the city differently than I had when I first arrived. The same skyscrapers that had once filled me with awe now felt distant, almost mocking, reminders of a dream that had never truly been mine to access. I walked past the malls I had once admired in videos and felt nothing but exhaustion. The city hadn't changed. My understanding of it had. On my last night, Anjali helped me pack my suitcase, the same 2 suitcases I had arrived with 5 months earlier, though they now felt heavier somehow, weighed down by everything that had happened in between. She hugged me tightly at the door and said, "Not everyone who leaves is a failure, Sneha. Some of us just figure things out faster than others." Her words stayed with me throughout the long flight home, though at the time, I didn't fully believe them. I felt like a failure. I felt like I had let down my father's memory, my mother's trust, and my own younger, hopeful self, who had once believed Dubai would be the answer to all her problems. As I sat on the plane, flying back toward India, I kept thinking about the version of myself who had boarded a flight 5 months earlier, so full of hope, so certain that she was making the right decision. I wanted to reach back through time and warn her, tell her to ask more questions, to verify the company independently, to never hand over an inheritance for a promise made by a stranger over a screen. But that version of me was gone, replaced by someone far more exhausted, far more humbled, and far more uncertain about what awaited her at home. I had left India with 2 suitcases full of hope and a house sold for a dream. I was returning with 2 suitcases full of exhaustion, no savings, no job, and no home to return to. The only thing I had gained, it seemed in that moment, was a painful lesson about how easily desperation for a better life can be exploited by those who promise it. I had no idea, as that plane began its descent toward Indian soil, just how difficult the process of rebuilding my life would actually be, or how long it would take before I would finally understand what had truly gone wrong. Landing back in India felt nothing like I had imagined during those long, anxious hours on the flight. There was no relief, no sense of safety in returning home, only a heavy, hollow feeling settling into my chest as I walked through the airport, dragging the same 2 suitcases I had left with 5 months earlier. My aunt picked me up, and the moment she saw my face, she didn't ask many questions. She simply hugged me and said, "You're home now. That's what matters." But home, I quickly realized, wasn't really home anymore. My house, the one my father had built, the one I had grown up in, the one I had sold believing it would fund a better future, now belonged to someone else. I stood outside it once, just a few days after returning, staring at the same walls, the same gate, the same small balcony where my father used to drink his morning tea. A different family now lived inside. I didn't go in. I simply stood there for a few minutes, feeling like a stranger looking at a memory that no longer belonged to me, before walking away. I moved in temporarily with my aunt, sleeping in a small spare room that had once been used for storage. At 34 years old, after years of independence, I found myself starting over with almost nothing. No home, no savings, no job, and a confidence that had been deeply shaken by everything I had experienced abroad. The first few weeks back were the hardest emotionally. I avoided seeing old friends and neighbors, terrified of the questions they would ask. How was Dubai? Did you make good money? Are you going back? I didn't have honest answers I was ready to give yet. I spent most of my days inside, sorting through paperwork, trying to understand my finances, trying to figure out what my next step should even look like. Slowly, though, I forced myself to face reality instead of hiding from it. I sat down with my aunt one evening and explained everything: the recruitment agency, the false promises, the salary deductions, the passport situation, the exhausting hours, the savings that had disappeared. She listened quietly, without judgment, and when I finished, she said something that stayed with me. "You didn't fail because you tried. You only fail if you stop trying now." Her words pushed me to start rebuilding, piece by piece. I updated my resume and began applying for accounting and administrative positions locally, leaning on the experience I had built both before and during my time abroad. It took nearly 2 months of rejections and difficult interviews before I finally secured a position at a mid-sized firm in a nearby city. Not glamorous, not extraordinarily high-paying, but stable, with reasonable working hours and a workplace where I felt respected. I rented a small one-bedroom apartment, far simpler than the house I had once owned, but it was mine, built entirely through my own efforts this time, without shortcuts, without promises from strangers, without selling away pieces of my past for an uncertain future. Every rupee I earned now felt different, heavier with meaning, because I understood, in a way I hadn't before, exactly how easily everything could be lost. Months passed, and slowly, the heaviness in my chest began to lift. I started saving again, carefully and deliberately this time, setting aside small amounts every month, no matter how insignificant they seemed. I began speaking to my mother more honestly, sharing both my struggles and my small victories, rebuilding a level of trust and openness between us that had been strained during those difficult months when I had hidden the truth from her. I also began speaking publicly, in small ways at first, about what had happened to me. I shared my story with a few women in my community who had expressed interest in similar opportunities abroad, hoping to spare them the same painful lessons I had learned firsthand. I explained the importance of verifying agencies independently, understanding contracts fully before signing, and never placing blind trust in promises made by strangers over a screen, regardless of how convincing they sounded. One evening, nearly a year after my return, I sat on the small balcony of my rented apartment, drinking tea alone, watching the sunset over rooftops far less impressive than the skyline of Dubai I had once admired in countless videos. And for the first time in a long while, I felt something close to peace. I thought back to the woman who had once sold her father's house, convinced that a different country would solve every problem she had ever faced. I thought about how desperately she had wanted to escape the ordinary, ignoring the quiet stability she already had in pursuit of something flashier, something that looked better from a distance. I realized, sitting there with my tea slowly cooling beside me, that my mistake had never truly been about choosing to go abroad. Plenty of people build genuinely better lives for themselves through international opportunities, when those opportunities are real and properly understood. My mistake had been believing that changing my location alone would fix problems that had nothing to do with geography at all. Problems like impatience, like comparing my life to curated images online, like searching for an external solution to an internal restlessness. I did not fail because I went to Dubai. I failed because I believed that moving to another country would solve every problem in my life, without first asking myself whether the dream I was chasing was even real, or whether it was simply a beautifully filtered illusion sold to desperate people by those who profited from their hope. Rebuilding my life from nothing taught me more about resilience, patience, and self-worth than 5 months of struggling in Dubai ever could have. I lost my father's house, yes, but in losing it, I gained a far deeper understanding of what truly matters. Not the place where you live, but the clarity, patience, and self-respect with which you build your life, wherever you happen to be standing.